I'm Howard Teich. I'm founding chair of the Brooklyn Jewish Historical Initiative, and we're thrilled to have you here. Third annual Jewish Brooklyn Hall of Fame inductions, class of 2017. At the end of this evening, we will have inducted 32 people into the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame. It's pretty exciting. And we have in Brooklyn an extraordinary cross-section of people. Unbelievable, actually, when you think about it. This is a piece of it, what you'll see tonight in terms of the Hall of Fame. I can only think of Marty Markowitz right now, what he would say about Brooklyn. And as you know, I can't possibly say it the way Marty did. In fact, Marty would be talking about it as he came down the stairs before he got to the microphone. We'd be all excited about Brooklyn. And that's really what's about. And people are going to say, yeah, but Howard, you're from Manhattan. How could you possibly say Brooklyn? The truth is, my family came, they were Pitkin Avenue in Brownsville. And so the thing I know is once Brooklyn in your family history, it's always Brooklyn is a part of you. So I can say that too, and I'm proud of that. And when we talk about Brownsville, I want to make one mention of what we've done because it'll give you an idea of the Brooklyn Jewish Historical Initiative. We've had there's a Jewish War Memorial over there that really had been somewhat forgotten. And we've gone over there on Memorial Day for 2 years now. This will be the third coming up. Last year was part of the centennial celebration of World War I, which I'm now learning we should call the Great War or the War for Peace Forever, or something like that. Because the truth is, it wasn't called World War I until after World War II. So that was a war, and that's why a lot of the memorials you see are more about peace than just in terms of carrying weapons. That was a war that they thought was going to finally end wars, and you had things come out of it. So the historical perspective of what took place in Brooklyn, through oral histories that we're doing, through other things that you'll see on the website, pitch for it, www.brooklynjewish.org. Please don't forget it. Please go to it. There's a lot of information. In fact, we had over 80,000 people come to the site last year from all over the world. 10% came from overseas. So we're pretty proud of that, to tell you the truth, in terms of what's been accomplished over the last decade. But we can't possibly do it and continue it without all of your involvement. What's your involvement? Telling us your stories of Brooklyn. Go to the website. You'll see, tell your story. You can actually put in your story in 200 words or less. If you want to do it twice, you can do 400 words. And Serena Raffet, who's co-chair, and others will review it, and then it'll go up on the site, and it'll be there for posterity. It's important that we have a record of the Jewish community of Brooklyn, and this is the place to do it. This is how we're doing it. And this is a legacy project. Hopefully, your kids, your grandkids, their children will be still putting up stories 50 and 100 years from now on this site. That's, of course, at that time, it won't be a website, it'll be something else.
I'll be very, very brief. Welcome to you all. It's really a great privilege to have this particular event take place at the Brooklyn Historical Society. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to be helpful in various ways as this initiative got off the ground. As you can imagine, the Brooklyn Historical Society is really dedicated to the stories of all Brooklynites. So, as you know, that's a pretty big task, and that means we are out and about in neighborhoods and communities at every place, every possible nook and cranny of Brooklyn is our responsibility. But the Brooklyn Jewish community, of course, which is not one community, is many, many communities, is obviously a very central part of the story of Brooklyn. And so it is wonderful for us to know that we have an ally and a partner in a community-based group like the Brooklyn Historical Initiative. It's really very wonderful to see this happening. I often imagine, and Howard and I have talked about, how there are other communities that have lots of things that they could learn from this community. So I don't want to say more because I want you to be able to get on with the show tonight. I'm very delighted to see our council member, Steve Levin, here with us tonight. Steve, welcome. And for you, for all of you to know how deeply this institution, our political allies care about what happens here with the cultural stories and life of the Jewish community of Brooklyn. So have a marvelous evening. Congratulations to all of the honorees tonight. Thank you.
I'm just excited to be here. As you may not know, I'm not from Brooklyn, but I'm from New Jersey. But I do have Brooklyn Jewish roots. My great-grandmother actually was born in the old country, which was Lithuania or Russia, depending on what side of the border and what year. But she grew up in Brownsville as well, and as did her brothers and sisters. When they got here in the 1870s, they immediately changed their name to Jackson to try to fully assimilate as much as they could into the American culture at the time. But they grew up kosher and going from railroad flat to railroad flat, trying to make it here in New York. And that has really informed my love of this borough and my love of the history of all things Brooklyn, but a special part of my heart for the Brooklyn Jewish community over the years.
Tell you a story. I was born and brought up in Brooklyn. Obviously, it gets into your gut. And then my father got a little money, and what did he do? He took us to Forest Hills. So what happens in Forest Hills? You can't play potsy on the street. You can't play stickball. You can't play stoop ball because nobody has any stoops. And you can't get egg creams. It took me years to get back to Brooklyn. I finally married a wonderful man. Matter of fact, my grandson, Jack Allen, is back there somewhere. But by the time we got to Brooklyn, and he was a Southerner, what did he know about egg creams? By the time we got to Brooklyn, there were no more egg creams. No more Charlotte Ruses, no more egg creams. And I was too old to play stoop ball. But we are fortunate enough to have found the last of the Seltzer Man. And his name is Alex Gomberg. And Alex, for those of you, wait. How many of you in this room remember egg creams or have had one recently? You know there's no, well, Alex will tell you what's in it. I'm not going to do that. How many people have never had an egg cream? You're first online. And besides Alex, we have a special honor afterwards with Eli. Some of you certainly remember Eli because he delivered seltzers to Brooklyn all of our lives. All of our lives, Eli? Oh, okay. Well, most of our lives. So now I'm going to turn this over to Alex Gomberg, who's the last of the Brooklyn Seltzer Boys, and he's going to demonstrate how to make a real Brooklyn egg cream.
So first, I just like to thank Eli. He doesn't realize this, but Eli's been a mentor to me in this business for the last 5 years that I've been in it. I'm fourth generation in the business. My great-grandfather started our seltzer company back in 1953. So me being fourth generation and trying to continue the legacy is important, but it couldn't be important without the help of Eli, who up until a couple of months ago was still schlepping seltzer all throughout Brooklyn at the age of 80. Should I give away your age? Can I give it? 83 years old. 84 years old. So, and delivering seltzer is not an easy job. It's actually... Girls don't frighten me. Girls don't frighten. I don't have to tell you. I don't have to tell Eli, but seltzer is a very, very laborious job. Schlepping a 60-pound case like that up 3 levels of, 3 flights is not easy. And I don't know how you still did it at the age of 84. That's unbelievable. But other than seltzer, a very big piece of history and Brooklyn and Jewish culture is this drink that I'm about to make. And it consists of our seltzer, Fox's You Bet syrup, and milk.
Where's the egg? Where's the egg?
So there is no egg currently in an egg cream, although many people say that there used to be an egg white in an egg cream. That's a myth. The egg comes from the white foamy head that you're supposed to get from the egg cream when you make it. There should be a nice thick white foamy head, and that's where egg cream came from. But basically, and I hope everybody gets to experience this a little bit later on. But you take Fox's You Bet syrup, and they weren't too far from us. Where were they? In what area were they in?
Where I live?
No, where was Fox?
Fox was on Dapper Street.
Right. East New York. Not too far from me. You take chocolate, you take the milk, and it's cool we have these glasses that have the lines on it to how to do it for those who don't know. And then you take the seltzer. But the very important piece of making an egg cream is how you do it. You have to take a long spoon and you have to deflect the seltzer off of the spoon, just like that. And you'll see that there's a white foamy head on top. And you mix. There's an egg cream.
Good evening, everyone. So I was raised in Brooklyn, in Bensonhurst, where the JCH, the Jewish Community House, was a place to go, a place to be, a place where all Brooklyn Jewish kids hung out. And if you didn't know how to play stoop ball or street ball or hit the penny or any of the great games that we played on the streets of Brooklyn with our Spalding balls, okay? How many remember that Spalding ball, right? What a great childhood we had. When I tell my grandchildren I didn't have an iPad, I didn't have a Kindle, I didn't have an Xbox, all I had was a Spalding ball. That was the one toy that you needed to play. Because with that Spalding and your imagination, all of the things that you could do, okay? My husband tells me about playing in the park on Avenue P and playing squash against the wall. He was a handball champion for his school, for Lafayette High School. And so that's what it meant to grow up on the streets of Brooklyn. And that became the core of who we were. And anybody who was raised in Brooklyn knows that the core of who you are, once you're from Brooklyn, you're always from Brooklyn. It doesn't matter where you are, where you live, where you go. Brooklyn and being Jewish is part of your culture, part of your history, part of your very being. But it also means something else. Being Brooklyn and Jewish could mean a different ethnicity. It could mean Eastern Europe. It could mean the Ukraine. It could mean the former Soviet Union. It could mean being from North Africa, from Morocco, from Egypt, from the Middle East, from Lebanon, from Syria. My family background is Syria. It could mean being from any one of a number of countries from around the world. And each one has its own unique culture and unique vibrancy and contribution to being Brooklyn and Jewish in our borough. And that's what BJHI is all about. BJHI is all about capturing and furthering those cultures and all of the different things that make up the culture and the beauty of and the contributions of being Brooklyn and Jewish. And the contributions that we as a borough and as a people have made to society in science, in literature, in entertainment, in the arts, in culture, in science, in medicine. The list is endless in terms of the contributions we as Jews have made, not only to Brooklyn as a borough, but to society at large. And that's what BJHI is here to capture. And that's what we need your help with as we move forward. So getting on with our Hall of Fame and identifying our Hall of Fame and who the people are that we have this year, the first person that we would like to announce is Assembly Member Helene Weinstein, and she will be presented with her award by Howard Teich, my co-chair.
Well, this is a great honor to have you. I just want to say a couple of brief comments. I've known Helene a long time. She's an astounding member of the Assembly, has just been appointed by the Speaker as chair of the Ways and Means Committee. It's an astounding honor, and to listen to the Speaker talk of her and the reasons for why he did it in terms of the greatest legislator, the brightest could be, head of judiciary before, well-deserved, and, if I can add, the first woman ever to be chair of the Ways and Means Committee. So it's with enormous pleasure that we induct you into the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame. And what we'd like you to do is if you would give us a few comments about, to open it, about your experience in Brooklyn, your upbringing, and what does it mean to be Brooklyn and be so successful?
You know, now, I first got elected to the legislature in 1981. I represented at that time, Crown Heights was the northern portion of my district, and East Flatbush, which had been going through changes, had been a Jewish community and was becoming less and less. Now represent the area. East Flatbush is sort of my northern border. I go down to the water. I used to say I represented Brooklyn from A to Z, from Avenue A to Avenue Z. Now we came up with a new slogan. It's from D to the C, from Avenue D to Emmons Avenue, Sheepshead Bay. But growing up Brooklyn, you know, when we were mentioning stickball and Spaldings, we left out playing Scully on the sidewalks with a little, you know, with the bottle caps with a little bit of wax in it. It was a real talent to get just the right amount of weight so it would go far enough but not too far. And these days, when I tell people I'm from Brooklyn and I was born in Brooklyn, I was born in Brooklyn Jewish Hospital, I'm sure there are a lot of other people here. Now people don't know, they say, what's that? Because it doesn't exist anymore. But when I tell people I'm from Brooklyn and I'm Sheepshead Bay, if they're not Brooklynites, sometimes they get really excited. Oh, I heard good things about Brooklyn. It's really the up-and-coming place. So a lot of us get the benefit of some of what's happening in Steve Levin's district and other districts in more this part of Brooklyn. You know, growing up, I was born in Borough Park, but not the Borough Park of today, and then moved to Canarsie. I know the Seltzer guy is from Canarsie, and it was I think what Howard we just said is right, that your childhood really does sort of set you in the direction of where your life is going to be. My parents were active in the community. They helped form the Civic Association. There was not a synagogue, a temple of conservative shul in Canarsie. My dad helped found that shul. I went to Hebrew school in what we used to call the shack, but it was, because that's all it was. It was just like a one-room schoolhouse that wasn't really but went to Hebrew school. We moved into Canarsie. There were dirt roads that we would go. I would go with my sister and my brother my sister on her tricycle, and we'd go around and fight for lights and fight for sanitation to come down our block. We had to bring garbage to the corner and to get the streets paved. And I think that experience, when I was in elementary school, really, and at PS 114 and then at Bill DeSee Junior High School, that those experiences really shaped my desire to work for my community. And I think I've carried it. That's really been the foundation of what's gotten me to where I am today. And then the longevity and the of being in the legislature and really just working hard and having the luxury that a lot of my colleagues don't have of being in an area that I'm able to be reelected, hopefully because of the work I do, but also without a lot of political challenges, lets me work even more.
Brooklyn has been really special in terms of leadership in the legislature. We had Stanley Steingart, you had Stanley Fink, and you had others. What is it about Brooklyn that creates the kind of leadership potential that you as well have?
Well, I think somewhere I said that an attention to your community in a way that a lot of us have been lucky to not have to be as involved in the political struggle of re-election every 2 years. So we really have an ability to dedicate ourselves to the job in a way that others haven't. And I think it is our upbringing. I was the first woman attorney to be in the legislature. There are fewer and fewer attorneys, and I think that kind of background really does make a difference.
Well, we're thrilled that you're now part of the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame, and we thank you for being here.
Merle, you are an author, an activist, and a Rebbitzin. That's a very, very tall responsibility. Tell us how you became involved in the feminist movement, given your traditional background, which was patriarchal. Not only our culture, every culture was patriarchal. How did you become a feminist?
So somewhere here is Bo. Bo is a young journalism student from Columbia, and he asked me before the program began, he said, "So what was it like growing up as a kid in Brooklyn?" And I said, "I was never a kid growing up in Brooklyn. I was a girl growing up in Brooklyn." What was expected of me was that I would marry and have children. Not a bad thing to do at all. In fact, I wound up doing that, but really nothing more was expected of me. Warren and I lived in the tiniest apartment you can imagine. There was no place for privacy. My place was the stoop. So I would sit on the stoop with my back against the building and my legs spread out, and I would have a book from the library and a bunch of grapes. And I traveled everywhere on the books from the library. So the teachers I realized I wanted to mention, Mel Pettigrew and Larry Litwin and Samuel Gallant and Dominic Bongiorno were all English teachers. Those teachers, the public library, were hugely important to me. My daughter.
Your daughter, in a wonderful YouTube presentation, talked about you in glowing terms and described you as passionate and persistent. How did that affect your literary career?
I mean, the passion is what fuels the writing. Suffering also fuels the writing.
That's very Jewish.
Yes. And you can't do anything without being persistent. So she said when she was a kid growing up in our house, my husband was the Hillel rabbi at Princeton, so we lived near the campus. We had this little faculty house, and the dot matrix printer was in the attic, and she says she fell asleep most nights to the sound of the dot matrix printer, like printing out the next play, the next, piece, whatever. You mail it out, you keep a note, and then you just forget about it. There was nothing Jewish until Brooklyn College. I met an amazing rabbi, Norman Frimmer, who completely changed my life and the lives of many others. So I have lots of blessings from Brooklyn.
And I'm glad that was one of Norman's conquests. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, David, you've come a long way. You arrived here in the United States from Russia, and I believe that was in the late 1970s. And then by the 1980s, you were in Bensonhurst, and you had, I believe, you were very involved with a high school in Bensonhurst. And then you went to Brighton Beach. So you're moving around. And in Brighton Beach, you got involved with the Brighton Beach Chabad with Rabbi Winner.
That's
okay, we know I know Rabbi Winner. I know the Rebbitzin, Esther Winner. And there's a project they had there called Project Neshama. And what I'd like you to explain is when you arrived here in the late 70s, where did you end up first? And how did you end up going into Bensonhurst? And what high school were you involved with? And then Brighton Beach.
My family immigrated from former Soviet Union. Now it's Latvia, it's an independent state. Back in the 70s, we were part of this wave of Russian Jewish immigrants looking for political and religious freedoms. And my family was sponsored by Jewish community of Jersey City, which was very small. And we just stayed in New Jersey in suburbs. And then in 2000, I made Aliyah and moved to Brooklyn. From New Jersey. My friends are asking, my daughter lives in Israel, and asking, when are you going to make Aliyah? I said, I made Aliyah. I live in Brooklyn. I moved from New Jersey to Brooklyn. It was amazing. But my first introduction to Brooklyn was when I was in Italy as a refugee. We were stateless, waiting for our visa to United States. And growing up in Russia, we kind of, two things we knew about America. It's a chewing gum and American jeans and rock and roll. So I go to the market to buy the chewing gum. There was a big selection of all kind of a chewing gum. But my first chewing gum I bought in Italy was Brooklyn. It was a Brooklyn Bridge on it. So it was amazing.
I have a copy of that.
Okay.
I have that.
So I moved in 2000 to Brooklyn. I got involved into Jewish causes. You have to understand, growing in Russia, we were denied any religion freedoms, and we just kind of discovered our Jewish roots, and I didn't know what bar mitzvah means. How would you think about it? When we immigrated, people from joined asking, name the Jewish holidays. And I just knew only one Jewish holiday. I wasn't afraid if I don't answer the question, they probably wouldn't let me in the United States. So I said, yeah, I know, there's a Simchat Torah. I said, what is it all about? They said, well, we used to go to the shul in Riga. It was only one shul, and we used to get drunk. And that was the purpose of Simchat Torah. That's how much we knew. And I got involved into founding a Russian Jewish house school in Brooklyn and Bensonhurst because we realized it's a problem for Russian Jewish kids from assimilated background. Parents don't want to send them to yeshiva, but they would like to get them some kind of a sense of who they are, who they belong to. And we came up with this kind of a school with a taste of gefilte fish. And this is, and it's in Bensonhurst. It's actually, it's in the building of Sons of Israel, if you know Bensonhurst. That's Benson and 21st Avenue. And there used to be Talmud Torah building, and we school in that building. And this is high school for Russian Jewish kids, and they call it, the name of the school is Elite Academy of Science and Technology. And we already 15 years in business. We have probably We have a 12th graduating class this year.
And what about this project Neshama at the Brighton
Well, the
Beach
Project Neshama, it's, you know, it's a part of this Lubavitch outreach. You know, for some reason, we Russians find something very in common with Lubavitch. Out of all the Hasidic groups, they drinks most. So the Lubavitch knew exactly how to get to Russian. First, they offer you drink. And then after you drink, I said, well, have another drink. And they call it l'chaim. I said, look, you don't get drunk, you just get happy. You know, it's a l'chaim. It's nothing to do with drink. So I guess that's, you know, I've just run into this amazing person, Rabbi Wiener, who was the rabbi of the shul on Brighton Beach. It's Sibir's Jewish Center. It's amazing because basically American Jewish community kind of gave up on Russia and said, nah, they're too assimilated, nothing's going to come out of them. But it's amazing how many Russians are flocking to the synagogues on Brighton Beach. I mean, we have like you know, Brighton 4s, we got Brighton 6, we got Brighton 11, and it's amazing. You come for Shabbos and it's full, and mostly Russian Jews from the Soviet Union, and they're going back to their roots and going back to the Yiddishkeit.
And you were honored by Project Neshama.
That's happened
in Brighton Beach too.
I was probably a very good drinker.
And bringing the the Russian youth to indoctrinate them to the customs and traditions of Jewish Brooklyn.
That's right. That's right.
Well, you did a great job. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
It's a good follow-up to what we were talking about the people coming in from the Soviet Union. Malcolm is one of the people I respect most in the Jewish community. I've known you for the lifetime of what I've been in New York. Malcolm was head of Jewish Community Relations Council of New York when I came around, helped us with something called the Round Table, which was young people. He'd been supportive of young people forever in terms of establishing themselves and empowering themselves. And of course now I consider him probably one of the most important people in the American Jewish community as president of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. It doesn't get better than Malcolm Hoenlein. And he's lived in Brooklyn for a very long time. So I'd like you to just tell us anecdotally two things, really. One, in terms of Brooklyn, and two, what does it feel like to be the governing force for so much of the Jewish community in America?
Well, first of all, thank you, and I appreciate this, and to be with all of these distinguished people is an honor. I came to New York in 1971 to start the Conference on Soviet Jewry, and I was born in Philadelphia, but I'd always been attracted to Brooklyn. I came for holidays to Crown Heights. I would go to Lubavitch. I would come in for a sandwich often because we didn't have kosher restaurants in Philadelphia at the time, and always had a kinship and an involvement somehow with Brooklyn. And when we moved, because of the demands of my life, I wanted my family to have a support structure, so I wanted to live in a community. And Brooklyn was a place where you could find a real community with friends, and that you knew your family was secure and safe. And that has been true since then. I have lived in East Midwood since 1970. And many people don't believe it when I tell them, and they ask where you live. I try to keep it a secret, so now that it's out, only because I just don't want certain people to know where I live. But Brooklyn has been very good to me, and I try to be good to it. And one of the things I'm most proudest of the Russian Jews who, because of the common efforts, you were involved in many others, came to New York, were freed, hundreds of thousands who came here. So we achieved Let My People Go, but we also had to achieve Let My People Know, and some of the efforts you heard about, but many more, that the Bible teaches us that we wanted to free the Jews from Egypt, but in order for them to serve God and to be able to live full Jewish lives, which they were denied for so many years. And I quickly adopted to it, and in 1976 became head of the JCRC. We started it. And a major focus was Brooklyn, building the community councils, building the relationships on a political level, which had never been done. New York was never seen as a Jewish community. There were communities in New York, and there was a lot of opposition when we created it. In fact, one of the leaders of the community, after I gave a speech at one of the central funding bodies, got up and started yelling at me and said, "Why do you talk of a Jewish community? There is no community. What is this community?" But thank God we were able to build a community. We did it in Soviet Jewry, building a movement, not an organization, where people devoted their lives, and mainly in Brooklyn, I know people who lost their jobs because they were so devoted to the cause of Soviet Jewry. And meeting amazing people, and I will mention just one because I think he embodies what I found so attractive about Brooklyn, and that was the late Tony Genovese, who was such an exceptional human being. He was gruff on the outside, he looked tough, but he was the softest inside, and a man so devoted who gave away his last nickel to people poor, and was the guy who defended Jewish poor before it was popular to defend Jewish poor, and was very linked to Stanley Fink and to the other people you mentioned. But and went to Israel with one of our first trips, and was so in love with Israel, so in love with Jews. It was a genuine thing. And what you said earlier, that you can't distinguish people from Brooklyn, very hard to know who's Jewish and who's not Jewish, because everybody is Jewish from Brooklyn. And I meet people all around the world who tell me that they're from Brooklyn. I know that there's a figure that tells that 80% of Americans came from Brooklyn, or maybe not 80, maybe 60, but a good enough number. Nobody ever says I'm from Philadelphia. You know what I mean? I don't know why, but everybody wants to be from Brooklyn. So, and now that Brooklyn's big comeback, you can be very proud because they think you're paying a lot of rent where you live.
And now the world knows you're from Brooklyn.
And now the world knows it.
Which is great. And I want to add, and I want to go back to about young people. One of the things, Malcolm, you've done, and certainly I'm part of that, has encouraged all of us to participate in the Jewish community, in leadership. He's not someone who looks at people in terms of, well, it's questionable. It's 100% supportive of anybody and others who are going to make a difference in the Jewish community. The talent of dealing with the wide range of people who you have to deal with in the Conference of Presidents has been astounding over the years, and maybe you'd just comment on what's that like?
Well, the reason I've been able to we have 53 national Jewish organizations, and I deal with leaders around the world of every kind. I just was Sunday in Morocco for a day. I was last week in the Persian Gulf. I have to go to many places, sometimes strange places for a Jew to be. But what I found is that if people trust you, it's the credibility of the case you make, the legitimacy of the facts you present, the sincerity that you're able to communicate, that people build a relationship with you, that there's no barrier you can't overcome. In the conference, which is harder than dealing with most of the Muslim and Arab states, because I have to deal with all these Jewish organizations, I give them a common enemy to unite around, me. So for these almost 33 years that I've been the executive of the Conference of Presidents, what I've seen is that what we have in common far outweighs our differences. Too often, the media and everyone outside focuses on what separates us, not what unites us. And the truth is that the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. And while there are legitimate issues and legitimate differences, and we can't compromise on principles, and we're not arguing for that, what we're saying is that you can create an atmosphere of respect, of commonality, and it doesn't apply just within the Jewish community, but between the Jewish community and all the other ethnic and religious groupings, that we create an atmosphere where people are free to express themselves. There have to be standards, there have to be some limits, but it is to recognize the value of every individual, the potential, what they can contribute, and to recognize the importance of unity. For us as a Jewish people, the one precondition to every miracle that happened to the Jewish people throughout our history was Jewish unity. And that's why I spent my life, my career, in umbrella organizations. It's not always easy to do so. And the two I started, Soviet Jewry and the JCRC, against opposition. But the message eventually got out, and many of those who were the strongest opponents became our strongest supporters. And within the conference, people now today come together and sit and work on issues like BDS, Iran, so many issues, security of Israel, fighting terrorism, the UN. These are all issues we have in common. There are no differences. And so then when you come to the issues on which we have conflicts, people say, but you know what? On all the other issues we agree, we'll put this in the right context. And too much in America, too often in America today, we see the rise of extremism and divisiveness and pitting people against each other on political lines, on religious lines, on all the lines that are possible. That is harmful to everyone and destructive to the national goals and the individual goals, and certainly in communities. So I think the role of conference, and I've been privileged to play a role in reaching out to many other groups, is a message that should be replicated by all, because we will all benefit from it.
It's indeed an honor to recognize the work of Ira Glasser as someone who suffered from the McCarthy era, personally and my family. I went to the ACLU for help. But that's not my first question. My first question is, how does a mathematician become one of the great civil libertarians of our country?
Circuitously. Yes.
Good result.
Well, you know, I was a boy in the 50s who was good at math, and if you were a boy, not a girl, girls were discouraged, even if they were good in math in those days. But if you were a boy and you were good in math, or science, it was very difficult to avoid being tracked in that direction. This was all, you know, the post-Sputnik era, and everybody was very excited about us catching up and getting ahead. So everyone was tracked into that. And I was very good at math, and and before I discovered that it really wasn't what I was passionate about, I had already was out of graduate school and teaching. And I probably would have ended up that way if it weren't for the 60s and the turbulence around social justice issues and civil rights issues that emerged during that time, and created opportunities for a lot of people who had been tracked in one way to go the other way. A lot of people who cared about social justice, who went to law school to deal with estates and trusts and banks, left their law firms and volunteered with the ACLU and never came back and stayed there. Very few lawyers, I mean, Norman Siegel was one of the first in the late 60s. Very few lawyers at the ACLU went to law school to do that kind of work. If you went to law school, it was one of the reasons I never considered going to law school. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to go and join a law firm and do all that stuff. But the 60s opened up those possibilities, and I was young and thought that, well, you know, I can always go back and get a job with Grumman Aircraft or something like that. It was very much in demand. So I experimented, and I had the sense that if you can't experiment when you're 23 or 24 and take a chance, when can you? And so I wrote away to a lot of people, and I ended up being an editor on a magazine of political affairs, where there was another person, a young person about my age there at the time, Aryeh Nair. He eventually left the magazine and found a job at the ACLU. Later I ended up editing the magazine, and he became the head of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and called me in late 1966 and said they had a little bit more money, and they were thinking he was creating the position of associate director, and was I interested? And I said, I don't know. I mean, that's all for lawyers at the ACLU. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Well, he says, I'm not a lawyer either. And so I ended up taking that job for what I thought was going to be a brief period of time. And 20 years later, I woke up in a motel room in San Diego and realized that it had been a career.
Wonderful. That's an excellent segue into your love of the Brooklyn Dodgers and Jackie Robinson. How did the Robinson saga influence your civil libertarian activity?
Well, I thought that was something that had just happened to me until I met people at the ACLU, and I discovered that everybody my age who was working at the ACLU was an old Dodger fan. There were a couple of Giant fans, but they were morally confused. And there were no Yankee fans, I mean, at the ACLU, none. You know, I used to say that if you were a Yankee fan in those days, in the 50s, you grew up to believe in oil depletion allowances. And if you were a Dodger fan, you became a civil rights advocate. And it turned out that that kind of comedy line turned out to be true. And I discovered it much later that what I thought was my unique experience was in fact experienced by many people. I mean, I was 9 years old when Jackie Robinson broke in. And it wasn't because, you know, I was a civil rights advocate at the time. It was because I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan. And they were attacking him, and he was our guy. You know, I often joke that if Robinson had played for the Yankees, I would have been a racist. You know? But of course, that was an impossibility because the Yankees were one of the last teams, I think the third from the last in the major leagues, to hire a black player, and they didn't do so until 1955 or 6. So we participated as young kids in that whole drama. I mean, I learned about segregated public facilities, about segregated restaurants and hotels, by listening to Red Barber on the radio describe the Dodger games in St. Louis, and I discovered that when the Dodgers went to St. Louis, Robinson and Campanella and Don Newcomb had to stay at different hotels and eat at different restaurants, and I hated that. I mean, that's where I first came to hate segregation, and it was only because they were doing it to the Dodgers. And we knew, we grew up knowing what Robinson was going through. We knew, we heard it all described. We knew about the racist taunts. We knew about, so it ingested in us. We became identified with it at a very early age, and in a way that was not cognitive. It was visceral. And way before I heard of Rosa Parks, and way before I heard of Martin Luther King, and way before I heard about Jim Crow, I hated what they were doing to Robinson. And this was a very unusual thing for a white kid in 1947 and 48. And when we went to Ebbets Field, because of Robinson, there were lots of blacks in the stands. And so, you know, I would go there 10, 11 years old by myself on the Rogers Avenue trolley, and I would be sitting next to this 40-year-old black guy drinking beer, smoking a cigar, and something would happen. You know, Duke Snyder would hit one over the scoreboard, or Robinson would steal home, and the two of us would be hugging and slamming each other on the back. And it wasn't until decades later that I realized what an extraordinary experience that was in 1947 for a 9-year-old white kid to be rooting with and reacting to a black man. And you know, there was a lot of stuff written about the effect that Robinson had on black boys growing up. There was very little written about the effect he had on white boys growing up. And it turned out, years later when I met Norman, when we were both in our mid-late 20s, he had exactly the same experience, and he had ended up exactly the same way. And the whole ACLU staff, at least of boys who had been of that age at that time, all had that same formative experience. And so, you know, our civil rights careers, our devotion to that, the importance it had in our lives was really a function of what happened in Brooklyn.
All right. Thank you so much. I want to mention that, hold it a sec. I want to mention that Norman Siegel ran for citywide office 3 times and lost 3 times. But in my book and in your book, he's a winner because he was on the side of justice and the right thing to do. So I thank you both for your great contribution.
And he's still doing it. And the reason he isn't here tonight is because he's in North Carolina at Duke University making a speech about civil rights in an area that needs it. So that's why he isn't here. Otherwise, he would respond to me in very hostile ways.
Yes. I learned from my mistake. Merle, thanks for teaching me. I'm supposed to hand this off. So
Okay.
this is a relay that I'm honored to be
I
part
have to
of.
give him this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You brought on some memories of busing. I went to Cunningham Junior High School, and I remember I had always been in an all-white class, and I remember a big bus with two kids, two black kids that came to my school when I was in 7th grade at Cunningham, and both of those kids were in my class in the SP. Some of you might remember they had special progress classes. The SP, Special Progress, because New York City schools were so overcrowded, they kind of pushed us through. So if you had a decent brain on your head, you did 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in 2 years. And I was in a class with a black boy and a black girl who got bused into our school. And that's my first memory of integration into New York City public schools. And that was 1967. Our next honoree is Judith Clearman, and she will be presented by Rita Schwartz, our board member. So please, Judith.
We've talked a lot about social justice and about religion, but we haven't talked about the arts. And we know how many people from Brooklyn studied at various settlement houses and studied music and played the fiddle, and how many people had piano lessons, of course. I met Judith, and she doesn't know this, at rehearsals at Carnegie Hall. She'd be sitting in the back, watching her organizations rehearsing, and I sat there at rehearsals saying, "That's Judith Clearman. Oh my, I'm sitting there with Judith Clearman." And she's a famous conductor, and she's a great musician, and she's just working away there, and you didn't know that.
Not at all.
No. But because I wouldn't talk to you, I was afraid, From a former musician to a hotshot, it was a big deal. And then all of a sudden, she shows up in Brooklyn. And it was only because, thanks to your husband, Cantor Bruce Rubin, who's back there, who is now the wonderful cantor of the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, of which I see many of our members here. And suddenly, I'm singing with Judith Clearman. Not only at Summer Sing, that was at Symphony Space one year, wasn't it? Well, anyway, but there I am, me, singing under Judith Clearman. And I am beyond hysterical because I've had lots of good teachers, and I've had lots of good musicians working with me, and I've worked with many, but boy, she's tough. She is tough. But I said to her one day, "What brought you into the Jewish world particularly? Why are you recording songs of the Jewish spirit?" We've talked a lot about lots of stuff here, but not the Jewish spirit. And I said, you must be from Brooklyn. And she said, "I grew up on Long Island." I went,
But I was born here.
That's why she's here. So tell us, Judith, a little bit about your grandmother, who you described to me at length.
Right. I'm from Flatbush. I lived there for a year. But my parents moved out to Long Island in the 50s. But we came to Brooklyn all the time, and I had to go to Nathan's all the time. And I loved coming here. And I was telling you this last week. I'm from Avenue U and East 13th Street, and there was a park right next to the apartment house. But walking on that street was magical, and I have never felt that feeling any other place in the world, because I got to know everybody in every apartment house, and everybody was my friend, and there were Italian, and there were Chinese, and there were Orthodox Jews, and there were Ashkenazis, and Sephardim, and everybody knew one another. And you said exactly what my mother used to say: it was the neighborhood. And I used to go play in the park, but I used to go visit my grandmother. I loved my grandmother. And I think every time I come on the subway and get off at Borough Hall, I really think about my grandmother. She came over in steerage, and she made a great life for herself, and she had 4 daughters.
my grandfather died when my mother was really young, and they all went to Brooklyn College. So I am very grateful for City University and Brooklyn College. And they were such big Dodger fans. Even though my parents moved to Long Island, Brooklyn was part of our lives. And I must say, coming into this building, I hung my coat up, and the banner from the 1955 World Series is up. Now, that's very holy. Speaking of Jewish spirit, that's just as holy as a piece of music, to see the banner from the 1955 World Series, because my father talked about it all the time.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about how you became so committed to teaching Jewish music, recording Jewish music, and studying it yourself, besides Bruce?
That's true. From when I was a little girl, music was playing in our home all the time. And I just learned it by osmosis. I was one of these pianists, choral people, singers with good degrees, but into the community activities, going to an Orthodox synagogue and just hearing it. But I think I never forgot anything I ever heard. It's weird. You just get to know it. It gets into your head. But I had graduated from Juilliard with a voice degree, and you have to make a living. So I started conducting cantors at Hebrew Union College, and I knew the choral literature, and I went and bought everything that was ever published and taught myself all the choral literature. And it's just been part of my life peripherally, although I married Bruce, and it became a big part of my life. And I love making music, and I love making good music. How the seed came into the world is I wanted to do some wonderful recordings, but more importantly, I publish, and I should say I edit a series for Hal Leonard and music for G. Schirmer and shop music. And music, the series is called Rejoice, Honoring the Jewish Spirit, which I do along with the secular series, which could be Christmas and Ave Maria or whatever. And there is a need in the world right now, and people want it in Europe and in the United States in non-Jewish schools, in a lot of Roman Catholic schools, for good editions of our music of our heritage. So that's how this is all happening, and I love finding new composers and having them write wonderful music.
Well, tell us a little bit about the music that you just conducted and some of the Jewish immigrant music, or some of the...
I asked Bruce if I could bring my essential voices to Brooklyn Heights, and why because of this series, and I will tell the story here because I think it's really appropriate. Bruce had a teacher at Indiana University named Aaron Marco Rothmiller, who was a famous bass baritone of the world, who had to leave Europe to have a career, and he was also a composer. And when we got married, in the 80s, Rothmiller sent us his music, and I wanted to put some of this music in my series. What I found is that the music was published in 1931 by Yivnei Publisher, which means build in Hebrew. And I went on a quest, my Women in Gold quest, if you saw that movie, to get the copyright out of Vienna. I was on the phone with Universal Music in Vienna and said I would like to get the copyright out of Vienna so we could have this music published in the United States, and I was told no, and the head of the company slammed the phone down, and we spoke again, and I said that you do not tell a Jew no. And I went into what the Holocaust was, and he still said no, so we got a lawyer, and it might not be a big deal of a piece, but it is to me because I'm putting this music back into print, and the plates were probably destroyed by the Nazis on Kristallnacht.
I just have one more thing to say. Although Judith has written and has performed enormous amount of the Jewish liturgy, if you watch the Thanksgiving Day parade, you will see her conducting on the float just before Santa Claus.
Thank you, Rita.
Oh, thank you.
So it's the greatest honor that we're inducting you into the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame. And if you want a wonderful experience, go buy his book. It's profound and wonderful in every possible way. And the second thing is go to the website, listen to your webcasts. One of the things that weren't mentioned also is that your family is the Allgemeine Press, that you now have inherited and run.
No, my father, who was, as I said, an immigrant from Russia and became a journalist, a prominent journalist, Malcolm, good friends with my father for many years. Father passed away 12 years ago. My father actually was in the Yiddish journalist world of East Broadway, Lower East Side. But then, after the Day Jewish Journal closed in 1972, he opened the Allgemeine Journal, a weekly Yiddish and later English paper, excuse me, and he moved it to Brooklyn. Okay.
I would love you to comment on what was it like being with the Rebbe those years, and how did that, being part of the Lubavitch community, impact your experience in terms of what you brought to the world?
You know, the theme is Brooklyn, so I'll try to weave together my Brooklyn experience and what I did and what I do, and my inspiration. I was, as I was walking in here, I was looking at where the word Brooklyn came from. Like who first gave it this name? So it was based in the Dutch colonies. It's a Dutch word that actually, with those that know Yiddish, it has some similarities. So it comes from two words. Brok, which is like broken, and lan, which is like land, broken land. And then when the English took over, they turned that from Brooklyn to Brooklyn. And I thought it was how apropos, because essentially the Jewish community, which we're honoring tonight, is essentially came as a broken community. Whether Holocaust survivors in the second immigration, the mid-40s, or the first immigrations, you know, they came here without money, without family, literally uprooted, forced out of our homes. It's not like anyone just came here because they were looking for, they had to leave because of the pogroms or whatever it is, and look what we built. And I think that's an unbelievable miracle in itself. How we took a broken land and we turned it into a strength that is really indestructible. And I just wanted to just acknowledge that. In my own personal story, I was actually born right when the Dodgers decided to leave Brooklyn. I was born in the mid-50s in Brooklyn, and I've lived here my entire life. So I'm like born, bred, you know. My parents were Russian-born, both my mother and father. They came right after World War II. And like refugees, they were in DP camps in Germany and in France, and finally made their way here. They got married in 1955. And I was born, the oldest of 5 children. I remember first I was born on St. Mark's in Crown Heights. This is all Crown Heights, I should mention. And then we moved to Sullivan Place. I don't know if any of you know that. Right across a little park. And then we moved finally to Montgomery Street. And today I live on Eastern Parkway. You've heard of this little street? The first great parkway in all of the United States. Does anyone know why it's called Eastern Parkway? Because it was the artery, the only connection from New York. There was no Long Island Expressway. There was no Queens. There was only Brooklyn. So Eastern Parkway was the way to go to the east. The journey to the east. Okay, there you go. So my personal life, I think, is very much reflective of Brooklyn in that sense, you know, coming from literally broken homes and broken lives. Post-Holocaust, my father and mother both came from Stalinist Russia, and we know that was what that hell was like. It was a short description earlier about Russian life and that Renaissance. So it's really it's a tribute, a tremendous tribute. So personally, I grew up in Crown Heights, and I went to schools here. In Bedford and Dean, there was the Chabad school. But then I also personally witnessed my childhood, the changes. If you all remember, the urban unrest in New York and all the downtowns, whether it was Cleveland or Philadelphia or Detroit or Chicago, everything changed. The whites ran to suburbia, and the communities, basically poverty and other factors. And I remember Crown Heights turning, I remember the thriving Jewish and white community, and then turning crime-ridden, remember Kingston Avenue, Utica Avenue, boarded up. It was quite depressing, actually. We're talking about the late 60s now, and then the early 70s. But then look now. You know, back again, we've rebuilt. Look at this Renaissance going on. And just think it's just really reflective so much of Jewish life, because that's what we're like. We're compared sometimes to the moon. It waxes and wanes. And is about to extinguish, it's reborn again. The moon is really a very appropriate analogy. As far as my own personal life, I grew up in the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which is central headquarters since 1940 is actually Crown Heights. They bought the hospital, which became 770 Eastern Parkway. It was a private hospital. And so it became essentially, so when I was born into that community. As I grew and I graduated, I became, as Howard said, I would call a secretary. I would say I was the writer of the Rebbe's talks, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks, but with one qualification. I wrote them after he spoke, not before. Most of these Farbrengens, which were gatherings, were talks delivered on Shabbat and holidays when there were no tape recorders or notes taken. So we were literally like walking oral scribes. We had to remember and retain sometimes 5, 6, 7 hours of these talks, which is a whole discussion of its own. So this is another unique little twist of Brooklyn. Brooklyn, the ability to retain and remember, and then I was responsible for actually writing, reconstructing it, and publishing. So I was basically worked very closely with the Rebbe and the ideas, which later became the book Toward a Meaningful Life, which was a distillation of these ideas. So I'm very proud, and I think it's all intertwined with Brooklyn, with Jewish life, with Jewish history, with, I would say, the Am Yisrael Chai dimension of us all living up to the ultimate destiny. You know, there's a Yiddish expression, if I may. They say, how many of you speak Yiddish? Okay. They say, "S'nishtokin krimere Zach via gleich Wertel." I'll translate in a minute. "S'nishtokin gleichere Zach via krumme Leiter." Und s'nishtokin ganze Zach via zerbrochene Herz. Loosely translated would be, there's nothing as crooked as a straight lie. There's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder. And there's nothing as whole and then as a broken heart. So we came from broken hearts, broken land, and we turned this into a, what can I say, a renaissance, unprecedented, and it's really proud to be part of that culture and part of your honoring it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Our last and most special honoree is Eli Miller, and I'll call on Rita again to interview Eli. Mr. Seltzer.
What can you say about the world's great seltzer man?
Well, I'm honored to be here among such distinguished people. I'm just an ordinary blue-collar guy who worked for 60 years, surviving. And the only positive thing about this is I built my own business. I was independent. And that I kind of take pride in. When I started out in the business, I didn't have a nickel. I went to my mother, and I says, "Mom, I'm tired of working on Wall Street. I'm tired of being a dividend clerk. I'm tired that every morning I see checks, $1 million, $2 million, and I got to break this down to people that have different shares, 100 shares and 2/3, 99 and 1/3, 38 shares and 1/8. I says, I'm tired of doing that. And I break it down to the exact...
Did you get any of it?
What? I never made an error. Never made an error.
Did you get any of the money?
No, I never got a nickel on it. So one day I walked into Mr. Kingsley's office. I said, "Mr. Kingsley, I've been here for about 6 years as a dividend clerk. I'd like to be promoted, get another job in this firm." He says to me, "Well, what do you want to do?" I said, "Well, I like to sell stocks and bonds." He said to me, "Do you have a degree in finance? Do you have any experience doing this?" I said, "No." He says, "Well, what makes you think that you can handle this job?" So I said to him, "Mr. Kingsley, you got these elderly Jewish guys out there who can hardly speak English. And they're on the phone and they're making a lot of money, and I like to do that." So he says to me, "Eli, you're Jewish, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Why do you say elderly Jewish guys if it's not proper?" I said, "I'm not being prejudiced. I'm just being realistic. They're old and they're elderly and they hardly speak English." So he says to me, "Well, I'll tell you what, Eli. Tell me what you're going to bring to this firm that I should give you the opportunity. I says, well, what did they bring? He says, Eli, these so-called elderly Jewish guys who you want to be with, they came with 250, 300 accounts. How many accounts do you have? I said, none. He says, none, and you want to be a broker selling stocks and bonds. I said to him, if I'm not given the opportunity, he says, I'll give you the opportunity, but you got to wait 6 months. I said, I don't want to wait 6 months. I'm going to give you a month to make a decision, and then I'm going to leave. He says, well, Eli, you might as well leave now. I said, no, I'll wait a month. So then I left. I'm sitting in my uncle's collision shop behind in Canarsie, on Ralph Avenue near church. And my fingers are touching the surface of this big black oak desk. And I'm looking at the big black oak desk and I see the scars. And I say to myself, at the age of 27, I'm lost and forlorn. I threw out dirty water without getting clean water. My father used to say to me, never throw out dirty water unless you got clean water. And my answer was to him, what can you do with dirty water? So anyway, my cousin comes out and my cousin says to me, I guess you're looking at that distributorship across the street. I said, what distributorship? I'm looking at nothing. He says, that distributorship, you see all those people coming up and buying a particular beer, this Copenhagen Castle beer? I says, no. I says, what people? He says, all these black people are coming in and buying this beer called Copenhagen Castle. So a light went off in my head. I said, you know what? Maybe I can do something with this. I went across the street and I introduced myself. My name is Eli Miller. My uncle owns the collision shop across the street. I'm interested in this beer you're selling, Copenhagen Castle. So he says to me, yes, I sell beer. He says, your uncle owns the shop across the street. What do you want to know about the beer? I says, well, tell me about it. He said, it's like Miller beer, but it's a whole lot cheaper. And it sells for $2 a case. I said, $2 a case? Let me look at a bottle of Miller beer and let me look at a bottle of Copenhagen Castle. So he brings out both, and I say, they look the same. I says, you know what? I'll take 40 cases. He says, 40 cases? You got to give me $80. I said, I don't have $80. He says, well, what do you got? I don't have anything. He says, you're walking here, you don't have anything, and you want me, I don't even know you want me to give you 40 cases of beer? So I said to him, listen, my uncle owns the collision shop across the street. Give me the 40 cases, I'm going to sell them. He says, you're going to sell them. Where you going to go with this beer? I said, I'm going to go to Bedford-Stuyvesant. He says, you're going to go where? I said, Bedford-Stuyvesant. He says, are you crazy? You want to get killed? I says, no, I'm not going to get killed. He says, why do you want to go there? Because nobody else goes there. So he says, I'll tell you what. Let me call your uncle. Calls my uncle. My uncle says, give him the beer. If he don't pay, I'll pay for it. So he says to me, okay, I'll give you the 40 cases of beer. He says, you got a van or something? I says, I'm going to get a van. So he says, when are you going to pick up the beer? I says, I'll pick up the beer tomorrow, but I'm going to get a van. So I go across the street to my cousin. I says, Lowell. I go across the street. My cousin says, this guy wants to sell a van for $190. I says, well, I got $150, but I need $40. He says, well, I haven't got paid from my father. He says, and he pays me on a weekend. I said, that's okay. I'll get it from my mother. I go to my mother, tell her the story. She comes back with 40 silver dollars. She says, Eli, here's my 40 silver dollars. I said, Mom, I can't do that. You've been saving these 40 silver dollars forever. He says, Eli, listen, I want you to find yourself. I believe in you. You told me you want to build your own route. You want to be independent. God, Shem, take the $40. I know that you'll make a success. I took the 40 silver dollars. I bought the van. I came back to him. He gave me the 40 cases. I went to Bedford-Stuyvesant. I came back. I told him I sold 40 cases of beer. He says, wonderful. He says, give me $80. I said, I don't have $80. He says, what do you got? I don't have anything. He says, wait a minute. You sold 40 cases of beer to Bedford-Stuyvesant, and you don't give me back even $1? What do you do with it? I gave each one a credit. He says, you what? He says, I can't believe this. He calls out his brother. Harry, come here. Harry says, Murray, what do you want from me? I got something to tell you about this schmuck. I gave him 40 cases. He went to Bedford-Stuyvesant, and he says he sold 40 cases, and he has nothing. And I said to him, Mr. Hillman, now you listen to me. These 40 black people own their own homes. They're good people. They promised me they're going to give me the money, and I believe them. Saturday, I believe them. He said, I'll tell you what, Eli. If you don't bring me the $80 by Saturday, I'm not going to ask your uncle for the money. I'm going to take you to court. I'm going to give you a summons. I says, Mr. Hittleman, you will get your money. He said, okay. I came that Saturday, and I said to myself, my face was drawn, and I felt sad. And I said to myself, how am I going to deal with this guy who has a deprecating, prejudiced attitude towards blacks? How am I going to address this now? I walk in, he takes one look at me, and he says to me, don't tell me you didn't collect your money. I dig into my pocket, I dig out a wad of money and place 4 20s on the table. I says, Mr. Hittleman, every one of those people paid me, every single one. And I told you that they're good people and they're going to help me. I said, Mr. Hittleman, do you know about the Tuskegee Airmen? The greatest black fighting unit in World War II, shot down more enemy planes. You heard of Jackie Robinson. You heard of Willie Mays. You heard of Frederick Douglass. You heard of George Washington Carver. Given the opportunity, these blacks can do everything just like us. And one day, Mr. Hittleman, we're going to have a black president. He looked at me and he says, you crazy? Not in my lifetime. And I said to him, not in your lifetime, but in my lifetime.
One last question. How many years did you deliver seltzer at Brooklyn?
For 60 years. And the thing about this is that Brooklyn to me is diversity. I had a different opinion about the neighborhoods I went into. One was Norwegian, Scandinavian. The others were strictly Jewish, Irish. But as I got to see, Brooklyn is the melting pot of America. It's the heart and soul of America. People have integrated so tremendously in Brooklyn that one neighborhood where I live in, which was once 60% Italian, 40% Jewish in Bensonhurst, now we have people from India, China, Bangladesh, Africa, you name it, people from all over the world. And that's great, and we all live in peace and harmony.
Thank you.
It's a privilege being here, believe me, with these distinguished people.
Howard asked me to bring the evening to a close, and I'm reminded of the first wedding I did years ago. And I got a wonderful note from the couple a week later. It said, Rabbi, thank you for bringing our happy relationship to a conclusion. So let me bring this to a happy conclusion. You find in life that goodness and greatness are two special qualities. I've learned that there are some people who are great resumes, but they don't have goodness. There are other people who have goodness, but never achieve greatness. It is so gratifying to be here tonight and listen to all of these people who have synthesized both worlds, who have goodness and who have greatness in one human being. Mazel tov.